What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danelle Hallan, and I am back with another true crime video. And today we're going to be speaking about the disappearance of 21-year-old Alyssa McLemore. Now, Alyssa is believed to have gone missing on April 9th, 2009 in Kent, Washington. The dates are a tad bit wishy-washy, which I will explain further in the video. But unfortunately, all these years later, it seems that authorities are no closer to bringing Alyssa home. Alyssa is part of the constant and ever-growing MMIW, which stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. I have covered just a handful of these cases on my channel because they very rarely get media attention. The statistics are beyond terrifying, and while I won't be going in depth in this video about the history of MMIW, why these things happen, I do have that in my Tamara Keepness video, which I'll make sure is in a playlist for you guys so you can go and look it up. In that video, I touch on things like residential schooling and the disparities that force the community into these high-risk situations. It's just such a nuanced thing that has affected generation after generation, and I highly suggest you guys just look into it on your own to get a better understanding. But to give you some sort of current statistics to show you how much of a problem this is, according to the U.S. Department of Justice, more than 4 in 5 Native women experience violence. On top of that, 56.1% have experienced sexual violence. And murder, you guys, murder is the third leading cause of death in Native women. Y'all, that is outrageous. It's actually 10 times the national average. Crimes and disappearances are underreported, whether it's from lack of trust from the Indigenous community or lack of caring by authorities. There's also no national database to get a good hold on the problem and how big it is. And reservations and police also have their own difficult relationship that, causes problems on that front as well. Many Indigenous missing persons are also often labeled under a different ethnicity, so the entire scope of the problem is honestly unknown. Because of all these problems, we know there are so many unaccounted for, meaning that those scary statistics that I just told you sway on the conservative side, which is absolutely horrifying. So I encourage you guys to amplify as many MMIW cases as you can, suggest them to other creators so there's a bigger voice out there for those that need it. So with all that said, let's go ahead and jump right into the details of the case. Now, Alyssa and her family are members of the Aleut tribe that originated from the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. Their family had generations prior decided to make the long move to Washington state, where the McLemore family would settle down but still hold on tightly to their traditions. Alyssa's mother, Gracie, gave birth to her at only 14 years old, and the entire family helped to raise her. She definitely didn't have a lack of people that loved her to the depths of their soul. And these Indigenous families, family units are not necessarily the same as you would see in European families. They're not such separate entities. So families would typically all live in the same home. They all have some sort of job or skill they can contribute, and they all help to ensure the safety and well-being of each other. So Alyssa was raised by her mom, her aunt, and her grandmother, all the same. She grew up being very, very close to her cousins. It was just an incredibly close-knit family. And as Alyssa got older, she really became her own person, and she showed a love for all things outdoor and active. Alyssa loved to canoe, she loved to play frisbee, she was always on the move doing something. She constantly had a smile on her face, she loved to make people laugh. She had such a nurturing soul, and no matter what Alyssa got herself into, her family always came first without question. She would drop anything and everything to care for someone in need, helping out as much as she possibly could around the home. These were values that had been instilled in her since she was born and throughout generations of her family. Unfortunately, in her teen years, these values would really be tested because her mother, Gracie, who was only in her 30s, ended up being diagnosed with something called scleroderma. I am no doctor, but from the minimal research that I was able to do, scleroderma is an autoimmune disease, and the most common form of scleroderma only affects the skin and directly under the skin. It's usually experienced by some form of tightening of those areas, and while it's very uncomfortable and can cause things like infections, usually it can be managed, and it's typically a milder autoimmune disease. But that was not the case for Alyssa's mom. Alyssa's mom had systemic scleroderma, meaning that it was not just limited to her skin. This can affect your internal organs, and this form can absolutely be fatal. Alyssa's mom, who had been attending school in hopes of continuing to provide a better future for her family, was now forced to drop out with this diagnosis. It was preventing her from doing a lot of things in her life. And Alyssa, who is now in her late teens, she just gave birth to her own daughter, daughter, had lovingly taken on the role as caretaker. And so Alyssa spent a lot of her time at the family home. She was trying to juggle raising her daughter, making her mom as comfortable as possible. Now, thankfully, it does sound like the father of her child was as helpful as he possibly could be. It doesn't seem they had a very consistent relationship. They were a bit on again, off again, but it seemed regardless of their status, they both worked their hardest to raise their little daughter, Nevaeh. So he would take Nevaeh while Alyssa was caring for her mom in those more extreme and intense moments.
Once her mom got sick and she had a baby, it made her grow up.
As she grew up, the 21-year-old became a dancer, active in the nightlife scene. She had been picked up by police in the past, but Tina says Alyssa was always there when you needed her.
And by early of April 2009, Alyssa's mom really took a turn. She, at this point, needed round-the-clock care, and Alyssa was the one to help provide that. But her disease had progressed to the point that she now required hospitalization. And according to the doctors, it didn't seem like Gracie was ever going to get the chance to go back home. And on April 9th, just shortly after being admitted to the hospital, Alyssa was out of the house. I'm not sure exactly what she was doing. No one knows exactly where she was. But at around 6:30 p.m., she received a devastating call from her grandmother, Barbara. News had come from the hospital that it was time. Her mom was rapidly declining, and they were not sure how much time she had left. So everyone needed to come by and say their goodbyes. Barbara told Alyssa to get back home as soon as possible. They had all lived in the same house together, Alyssa, her mom, her daughter, her grandmother, other family members. So she wanted Alyssa to come back there so they could all go to the hospital together. Now, Alyssa said she wasn't very far away, only like a few miles, so she would be home as soon as possible. Alyssa didn't have a car, so she relied heavily on public transportation or rides from her friends or family members, so it really wasn't that odd at first when about 30 minutes passed and Alyssa still wasn't home. There's no telling how far away she was, how many stops there had to be, so no one was really alarmed when it wasn't like an immediate 10 minutes and she's home sort of situation. But after an hour had passed, her family started to worry. They tried not to panic yet because this is also something incredibly difficult for Alyssa. This isn't a phone call that anyone wants to get, and maybe she just needed a little bit of time to center herself and prepare for what was about to come. But hours kept on passing, and Alyssa still never came home. And this is where things get a little bit foggy. Unfortunately, the timeline of when exactly these next events occurred is up in the air. Obviously, Alyssa's family was going through a lot. Not only did they have no idea where Alyssa was, but they're watching a loved one slowly decline from a devastating disease, knowing that the end is imminent. However, I am unsure why authorities can't seem to come forward and confirm the time on this, because so far, the dates are all over the place in the media. So either the 9th of April, which is the day that Alyssa received the phone call from her grandmother at around 6:30 p.m., or possibly the night of April 10th, a 911 call came into Kent dispatchers. Now, this call was very fast and very frantic. It only lasted about 10 seconds or so. And when the dispatcher answered this phone call, all she heard on the other side was a woman begging for someone to help her. It was obvious that this woman was in distress, and in between her pleas for help, you heard this male voice saying either, "I'll hurt you," or "I'll kill you." Right after this 10 seconds, the phone call went dead. Now, obviously, this is alarming. So the dispatcher decided to reach out to local law enforcement saying, "Hey, we just got this real bizarre phone call. We think the caller may be in trouble. Is there anything that you can do?" So authorities decided they would try to track the phone to be able to go and help this woman. Unfortunately, the phone that called in was a BlackBerry, and this particular BlackBerry didn't seem to be equipped with GPS. So they're like, okay, next best is to ping the phone. And they were able to do this and confirm that the call did come from the area of Kent, but they weren't able to narrow things down any further, and they felt there was no way they would ever be able to find the caller in this 2 to 3 mile radius area. So they decided next to look and see who the phone belonged to and go from there. This BlackBerry phone that made this 911 phone call belonged to Alyssa McLemore. Now, at this point, her family, I don't even think really knew that she was missing. If it happened on the 10th, they kind of had some idea possibly. Authorities didn't have her on their radar. So these are just two totally separate entities happening at the same time, coming together. With this information, two officers decided to head to Alyssa's family home a few hours after the call was made to make sure she made it home safe. And Alyssa's family was absolutely shocked when they expected to hopefully open the door to Alyssa, and instead it was Kent police. The authorities explained the situation and the 911 call, and Alyssa's family was terrified. She still at this point had not made it home, and no one was able to reach her on her phone, which clearly she did have at least for a period of 10 seconds. Again, if that was her calling, which it likely was. So given the circumstances, they're like, she's not come home. We knew something was off. This 911 call confirms it. Can we please report her as a missing person? But somehow, despite the fact that these two officers had gone out of their way to go all the way to Alyssa's home to check on her, to make sure she was safe, they also refused to report her as missing. The officers told Alyssa's family that she was an adult, she was able to do whatever she wanted, and they would have to wait at least 24 hours to report her as missing. Now, again, most of you should know this, but if you don't, that is not a thing. There is nothing out there that says that you have to wait a certain time period to report someone as missing. Authorities will recommend that, but if you strongly feel something is wrong, you push to get it done. And honestly, this is really, really upsetting because yes, while Alyssa was in fact an adult and she's fully capable of going off and doing things on her own, her mother is on her deathbed and she had just spoken to family saying she was coming home, and all of a sudden there's this 911 call. Family's been worried for hours, if not potentially almost 24 hours. Everyone is kind of panicked at this point. This is entirely out of character for her. And with the contents of the 911 call being a female screaming for help and someone threatening them in the background, I don't know, I just kind of would have assumed that authorities would have wanted to immediately hit the ground running. But unfortunately, that is just not what happened. And there is speculation out there as to maybe why this was treated the way it was. Alyssa did have a few run-ins with police a couple of times before this. She was involved in SW, which I'm sure you guys can gather what that is. I'm having to code speak because YouTube has been extra harsh on my videos lately. And we all know how that goes. If it's very common for someone that, has a history of drug use or alcohol abuse or SW in their current life or history, it's very common for them to be ignored when the reality is that they end up in riskier situations that honestly can be very, very emergent. Whether you agree with someone's life choices or not does not determine if they deserve to be assaulted or killed or looked for by authorities. None of that should have anything to do with it. They are still a person that is loved, that is going through life with just as much legal rights as the next. So I really hope that's not the case, but it is a huge possibility. And for the next few days, Alyssa's family did exactly what authorities had suggested. They were trying to still juggle her mother's health, prepare for her mother's death, and hoping that Alyssa would come home in time to say goodbye. And 3 days later, when Gracie passed, her daughter wasn't there. So by April 14th, Alyssa's family decided enough is enough. We're reporting her as a missing person. Not only would she never abandon her mother, but she didn't show up for the funeral. She was not showing up for her daughter. So the search for Alyssa began. Authorities started out by speaking to her family and friends, just the typical protocol to get a good idea of Alyssa and her activities, where she would hang out, who she was with, what she involved herself in, and they also took a pair of Alyssa's white go-go boots to get a DNA sample in case they needed it for forensics further on. They still did have the pings from her phone, but unfortunately, no matter what they really did with that, they couldn't get more specific, and unfortunately, within a few days of Alyssa first going missing, her phone was totally turned off. So Alyssa was labeled as an endangered missing person. But truthfully, the extent of the investigation into her disappearance is unknown. I can't find anything at all in local articles or any of the interviews with her family that really speaks much on the search authorities did. If they checked out areas that she may have been within the ping circumference that they had. I've got no idea if they went and checked for surveillance or if they questioned anyone in the area or really anyone outside of Alyssa's family. They have completely kept their investigation closed down to the public. And I do have to preface this by saying what I always say, that it is very important to protect the integrity of an investigation. You don't want to release too much or give too many details and it somehow cause issues further down the road when you're trying to prosecute or, anything along those lines. So I do get that, but this case is an example where not a single thing at all seemed to be shared. Knowing that there was a 911 call, her family was desperate to hear it. If there was a male speaking in the background, they all wondered, what if we know him? What if we're able to say, hey, that's our old neighbor, or that's an old boyfriend, or something that would help authorities find Alyssa, narrow down who she may have been with right before that 911 call ended. But the investigators refused to release this to the public and even to her family, citing evidence and the fact that it was an open investigation. So it seems that they didn't want to have to take on any of the random tips and things that are called in that may not at all be linked to the case. And I could understand that if they were already drowning in tips, but I don't even think that was the case. And maybe it's just me, but when you have a case where there's not a lot of information, using something like that call as a tool to, even if it's only just to start a conversation in the media, to get people's attention, to have people looking out, I just feel like it could have been of so much value. And while hindsight's 2020, I can tell you right now that so far that 911 call has done nothing to help the investigation. And ultimately, in the long run, only 2 tips ended up coming in that shed light on what may have happened the night that Alyssa went missing. One witness came forward to authorities claiming that they saw Alyssa with a white male in his 50s or 60s the night that it was believed that she went missing. This white male was around maybe 175 to 185 pounds, and it was around 5'8". And to the witness, it appeared that Alyssa and this man possibly knew each other. They didn't seem like total strangers, so it at the very least wasn't their first time speaking. And the key piece of information is that this man was driving a green truck. The second witness came forward claiming that they too saw Alyssa with a white male, very similar appearance, driving a 1990s green pickup truck. And they were able to add one more detail about the car, claiming that they believed it had out-of-state plates. So the plates did not say Washington, they actually said Oregon. And they also were able to bring forward a pretty specific location. Alyssa and this mystery man had allegedly been on 30th Avenue South and Kent Des Moines Road, which is not a promising area. This area is known for its heavy drug use, SW activity, and so this raised a lot of potential theories and questions. The fact that this same green truck was in both of these tips with similar descriptions of a white male, this could be it. This could be something that should have sent the investigators running wild. But unfortunately, again, we've got no idea what they did.
It just hurts to know. And this is what I say, Native people fall through the gaps. It doesn't matter what she was doing in her life.
This intersection off Pacific Highway South in Kent is where Alyssa was last seen. Witnesses say she was getting into a green pickup truck with Oregon license plates.
I've not been able to find any evidence of a bolo being put out for the truck, which I kind of expected to see. I have no idea if they went to question anyone in the area about this green truck, and honestly, if they didn't, that really sucks because of what this area is known for. There is such a high chance that this man was a customer of multiple different workers in the area. We know that Alyssa was involved in SW. If they had known each other, maybe this was a regular. And so there's a massive chance that someone else out there had interactions with this person, was familiar with this car, and potentially could have brought forward information. And authorities might have that, and we just don't know. We know for a fact that she said that she was going to be coming home. And since she relied on public transportation, maybe she said, hey, maybe I can get a ride from someone that I think I can trust, someone that I somewhat know and think could be a good person, a safe person. And unfortunately, that's just not the case. Now, despite the fact that there was some media coverage, there just didn't seem to still be a lot of movement in this case for years to come. Alyssa's family made numerous requests to the police to push this case forward, to search different places, maybe try different tactics, anything at all to bring their loved one home to not just them, but her daughter was now growing up without a mom. But almost every single turn, it seemed that Alyssa's family was told they couldn't put more manpower on the case. There just weren't enough resources, or they were already doing all that they could. And her family has stated that they were honestly fearful of questioning the investigation, questioning what authorities were doing, because they were scared that the police would just stop looking for Alyssa entirely if they did that. So they started to do everything they could on their own. Alyssa's family made their own maps of the areas that they thought were important to search, and they put boots on the ground to do it, constantly going somewhere to try to look for any sign of Alyssa. They were putting up flyers everywhere they could, talking to anyone that would listen, and they were even going through their own tips and chasing them down. And in the media, it was occasionally questioned why the police didn't seem to be helping the family. What were they actively doing? Because again, what I'm saying now is really all that was being released out there. And Detective Brandon Wales came forward during all of these questions and said that they just simply weren't sharing all they had done. Everything was being held tight to the vest. He explained that they couldn't tell the public every time they searched, or that's all they would spend their time doing. He also confirmed that they had been actively helping the family. When the family would go out on searches, he said if they ever called finding something or having a concern, that he sent people out immediately to help. But it would soon be uncovered that that was just not the case.
The family received a tip that Alyssa's remains were in the park.
I will not sleep at night if I got one tip that I did not follow up on. I can't say how deep it is.
While searching, they came across this deep abandoned well on the edge of park property. At the bottom, what looks to be a tarp.
I don't know what's under there, and my mind will always wonder until somebody does investigate it and say, nope, she wasn't there.
Ken police never searched the well or took measures to cover it up as a safety hazard.
We can't even get the city she's missing from to come and even take serious. They've never sent a team out here.
Based on the cell phone records, it's miles away from where even her cell phone would have been, and it just comes down to a time and resource of where it's at.
We pushed Detective Wales and the city to investigate and, at the very least, cover the well.
Like, that's a safety issue. A kid, a dog, anything can go down there.
The day after we spoke to Detective Wells, he and his partner came out to investigate. He confirms the well will be searched and investigated before it is filled.
At this point, I just think it's the really unfortunate circumstance where authorities have maybe searched and done bare minimum around the area. It's believed she may have gone missing, but now we're talking about going years and years into this investigation and there's just nothing. And at that point, you've got to broaden your search. You've got to try something different because what you're doing is obviously not working. And it's really unfortunate to see that the family took it upon themselves to do that and seem to be getting so much pushback from authorities. If authorities had nothing to show at this point, why not at least try to listen to what the family was saying? And the following day, after being called out publicly, authorities did in fact go out and search the well, and nothing ended up being found, but at the very least, her family was able to rule out the awful thought that she was down there and were able to feel, if even for a moment, that someone else cared about finding her. Those that know and love Alyssa continued for years to search, some raising funds for a Crime Stoppers reward, and it wasn't until 2 years after her disappearance that authorities finally came to collect familial DNA, which, by the way, is something that is legally required to be done in the state of Washington within 30 days. And this is not the first case that I have done a video on where I've had to say that exact same sentence, unfortunately. So that was put into a national database, and still the investigation continued. And speaking of things that took way too long, 7 years later, her files were finally fixed. Unfortunately, at some point or another, her ethnicity was mislabeled as Asian, so they were finally able to go in there and change that. So many things were totally overlooked. And it wasn't until 2019, the 10-year anniversary of Alyssa's disappearance, that it seems things kind of started moving again. This is where I finally started seeing more recent articles being posted again. There had been all these years of a gap, and now it felt like there was something. This entire time, her family had been holding their own memorials yearly at a local park, doing everything they could. They would go and gather and share their memories. They would release red balloons with little messages for Alyssa on them. But unfortunately, they were never able to really do a lot of the larger things, like put a billboard up. But thankfully, that year, they managed to work with a program through the Washington State Patrol called Homeward Bound. This was a program that had been started back in 2005, and it essentially plastered the details and the photographs of missing persons, at this point only missing children, onto the side of semi-trucks that would go on to travel all over the country. And while this program typically did only focus on children, they looked into Alyssa's story. They heard what her family had to say, and they knew that they needed to make this happen. They needed to be able to help in whatever way possible. So it was announced that Alyssa's face and all of her information would be on the side of a gigantic semi-truck. And this was absolutely huge. If those tips that were originally called in about this green truck potentially being from Oregon, it's not beyond the realm of possibilities that Alyssa may have been taken to another state. Now, over the next few years, more articles were posted where it seemed that investigators in Kent were finally asking the public for help. Essentially, it seemed like they were just making a plea for tips. And a push was made to reignite Alyssa's story to get people talking about it again so that hopefully they would finally have some sort of information. And while they still wouldn't share the 911 call with anyone, including the family, finally in 2021, they did share at least the transcripts with Alyssa's family. It seems they'd already been given the rundown of what was in the phone call, and so I'm not sure how helpful that was. I think it probably was just done to make Alyssa's family feel better.
A few years later, I did ask to hear the tape, and I was denied that. Now it's a piece of evidence, or maybe I know this guy's voice. Maybe I could recognize it.
14 years have passed. The family wants to know, why not release this 911 call to the public?
As investigators, we don't want to taint the investigation by releasing that. We will be inundated with assumptions and conclusions and, for lack of a better term, a red herring of who it could
And
be.
Detective Wales even went on to say that the FBI had decided to look into the 911 call. He announced very briefly, I literally found one article on it about how they were looking into this call to separate the sounds. And so my guess from that very brief mention of this is that they are hopefully attempting to isolate the male speaker to maybe get a better picture of what he was saying, since it seems that they're not entirely sure what was being said, maybe to see if there are any unique sounds in the background that could answer any questions. So when I saw this, I was so excited to see if there was any results on this, if there was anything more. But unfortunately, it doesn't look like anything has been released in regards to the FBI's analyzation of this call. So that is literally where we are at this point, 15 years after Alyssa went missing. Alyssa's family has made her memorials private, and they continue to push and search for her. Her aunt Tina saying, quote, "I don't want another family member in my family to die without answers. I don't want to die myself without answers. And the next generation has to pick up the search. I don't want her daughter out there looking for her, because that's going to be the only way she's going to find her. I mean, who else is looking besides us at this point?" My heart absolutely broke for her family reading that. When you are experiencing true crime, it is already isolating enough, and to feel even further isolated is something that I cannot possibly imagine. This is why I'm such an advocate for victims' rights and different nonprofit organizations that work state to state that help families in situations like this. These organizations will help families and victims of true crime, find different resources to help themselves, like therapy. And while these organizations are out there, there are definitely not enough. Now, Alyssa's daughter is now a teenager. She's doing all that she can to help look for her mom as well. She's helped to pass out flyers for a long time. She's helped to pick out the pictures that would be used on the flyers. And on top of that, another big change is that the family, specifically Alyssa's grandmother, has moved from Kent to Auburn. And this was something that I'm sure was a very difficult thing to do. And she's made it a point to tell people that she has moved. She wants this known in case Alyssa tries to go back home. Since I cover so many larger cases, especially recently on my channel, cases that have a ton of media attention, I mean, I could research for days and days on end and keep stumbling into new information. Cases where there's so much done by authorities, where there's great communication and amazing resources that are used, that this is a wake-up call to everyone that this is just not the reality for a lot of families. I am at this point unsure what exactly we can do to help Alyssa's family at this point, other than just keeping her story out there, keeping her face out there, and being here ready to jump if they ever need a single thing, if they need fundraising. I encourage you guys to share Alyssa's story far and wide, share her missing persons poster. I do have a link to one down below that seems to be the most recent and accurate, because someone out there knows the truth and may have told someone else. Those answers are exactly what is needed right now. And while this is such a heartbreaking case, this family has had to go over a decade with essentially absolutely zero answers, I wanted to end this video with a bit of change that's happened in the last few years that will hopefully go on to help missing and murdered Indigenous women and just Indigenous persons in general, and hopefully will prevent what happened to Alyssa from happening to other people. Now, as I said in the very beginning of this video, there's not a lot out there to support the missing and murdered Indigenous population. It is something that is so hush-hush and swept under the rug. So Attorney General Bob Ferguson from Washington State worked alongside many others to begin efforts to push legislation that would begin a, drumroll please, multi-million-dollar Indigenous cold case unit. A vast majority of these cases go cold, you guys. So having a unit specifically dedicated to working them would change absolutely everything. I mean, you've seen what it looks like during an active investigation, so you can only imagine what happens to these cases when they go cold. They are literally put up on a shelf and do nothing but collect dust. Also, having allotted resources specifically for these cases would also change everything, because according to data, even though the indigenous population makes up only 2% of the population in Washington, they also somehow manage to make up 5% of all unsolved cases. And I was so excited when I saw this, and I was honestly nervous to see if it ended up passing. I knew that enough time had passed since the article where it was first mentioned that there had to be something. And honestly, I about flew out of my chair when I saw that it freaking passed, you guys. Governor Jay Inslee signed it into law in April of this year in Washington state. Not just that, literally a few days ago, they announced that they have hired a lead investigator for this cold case team. And I am just like beside myself at this information. Brian George will now be serving as the lead investigator, saying, quote, "This is meaningful, important work supporting law enforcement and bringing closure to families who have been waiting too long. I'm eager to get started." Brian George has over 25 years of experience working Washington State Patrol. He's been an officer with a tribal police department for some period of time. And I honestly have so much hope that this is going to make a difference for these families that still have no answers. And I have like all my Google notifications turned on now for Washington to see what cases they end up solving in the next year or two, because I have no doubt if they have access to these resources, there's going to be so much access to things like genetic genealogy. I mean, there's just got to be so much that they're going to be able to do. I also stumbled across something else that is current and you can actually help be a part of. In 2022, Washington also launched something known as MIPA. I think that's how they pronounce it, but it's an acronym for Missing Indigenous Person Alert. Washington ranks in at number 2 for the highest number of missing Indigenous persons in all of the United States. Again, despite making up only 2% of their entire population. It's similar to an Amber Alert or a Silver Alert, where it will show up on social media, it will show up on highway signs, but it does seem to lie in the hands of the investigator's discretion still, which the Amber Alert technically still does, but there's also like specific requirements that you have to hit to get the Amber Alert. Like local police or tribal police get to make the ultimate decision. Since then, Colorado is the second state to follow suit, you guys. They launched their MIPA alert in January of 2023, and there's apparently a lot of talk in other states and Canada even showing interest of implementing this exact same alert. So now is the time when you guys can make a difference. If you're in a state, try to figure out if this is a conversation, if this is something being introduced. By all means, be a part of it. Help be a part of this change that can make such a huge difference within this community. I hope that some of this makes some difference for Alyssa and for all MMIW. On that note, Alyssa is 5'1". She was around 130 pounds when she disappeared. She does have naturally black hair, but would bleach it. And she does have a scar on her abdomen. I have all the information possible linked down below, so you can go through all of my different resources. You can look through the different NAMUS and government websites that interviews. There's a great podcast that I listen to, so make sure to check all of those things out and use those to continue to tell Alyssa's story. That's all that I've got for you guys today. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to Alyssa's story. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallan fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.